Rarely ever do we have the opportunity to acknowledge the rich, complex, and innovative African societies that were the predecessors of major European powers. The mass production and innovation from ancient kingdoms like Axum, Kush, and Great Zimbabwe is often overlooked in favor of a Eurocentric analysis of world history. Thankfully, most are familiar with at least one of the prosperous states, ancient Egypt. Also known as Kemet, it's generally considered one of the cornerstones of human civilization. I mean, who would disagree? It was only one of the most successful societies in human history, pioneering advancements in medicine, agriculture, writing, art, politics, architecture, technology, but I digress. There is little historical debate on the success and existence of these affluent periods on the continent. But what exactly happened? Well, during this era, West African nations such as Mali, Congo, and Benin had already been doing business with European countries for centuries. Traders originally brought kidnapped Africans to Europe for slave labor until the 17th century, when the transatlantic slave trade really took off in the Americas. During this period, Africans were completely stripped of any freedoms and subject to the whims of their enslavers. While their labor was the backbone behind the economic growth of thousands in the early U.S., Africans reaped no benefits whatsoever of the American dream. Though the transatlantic slave trade ended in the 19th century, chattel slavery continued to subjugate Africans and their descendants for another 150 years. The U.S., while continuing to exploit Black Americans, began to prosper and thrive with international economic ventures, and free families began to see their wealth transfer from themselves over to the next generation. White households throughout the course of American history have been free to lay down a rich foundation for their descendants whenever they could or desired to do so. That right was never granted to African Americans. While enslaved, there was little to no opportunity to generate wealth and pass it down to their children. Once a slave to a family, any family you would have would also be slaves. Following the Civil War, there was a brief glimpse of hope that would allow Black people to gain assets, build wealth for themselves, and breathe for the first time in American history. General Sherman, serving under Lincoln, ordered that land, specifically 40 acres and a mule, be provided for those formerly enslaved as a jumpstart. After Lincoln's assassination, however, 40 acres and a mule was deemed too generous by the Johnson administration, who had already approved of the Homestead Act and believed white plantation owners to have lost the most during the war. The only reparations ever dispersed were to white slave-owning families. Despite the, shall we say, unfavorable arrangements, Black people began to form their own communities, fairly successful ones at that. The authorization of Black economic participation and citizenship led to self-determination in employment and in legislative representation. So much so that they outnumbered whites in South Carolina legislatures. Formerly enslaved folks now had an ability to manage money, accumulate wealth, and develop a political presence like never before. Black cities emerged across the states, primarily in the West as a result of the Homestead Act, and many of them had foundations for successful economies and markets. They were bastions for Black communities to achieve their economic potential without interference. Most of these towns were successful in drawing in Black populations, realizing budding economic potential, and empowering communities of color to finally produce generational wealth. Some of the most infamous communities, Tulsa, Haiti District, the 10th Street, U Street, and Seneca Village, were economic, political, and social safe havens, enabling Black businesses to thrive and revitalize desolated areas pushed to the corner due to segregation. Unfortunately, many of these havens for Black economic prosperity were destroyed. The Tulsa Massacre, the Red Summer in Chicago and D.C., and the race riots in Atlanta were all instances of attempted erasure of Black presence from the socioeconomic and political makeup of the U.S. The economic discrimination and oppression was written into our legal framework through Black codes and Jim Crow laws. Unequal treatment was legalized and validated through judicial cases, crippling social mobility and our capacity for wealth accumulation. Beyond the segregationist lie of separate but equal, practices such as gerrymandering, poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses all serve to continue the disenfranchisement of Black Americans. Without the ability to mobilize the vote against oppressive measures, the only institutions and resources to rely on were built on the exclusion and suppression of Black ventures. The existence of redlining and white flight similarly devastated Black communities and further entrenched race and class together. White flight, or the fleeing of neighborhoods that people of color move into, lowered property values in that area. By outlining neighborhoods of color as high risk and not providing them loans, infrastructure was devastated. Resources that were dependent on property taxes, like public schools and hospitals, were not getting the funding necessary to run effectively. While entrepreneurship and black businesses popped up at an unprecedented rate, the systematic inequalities only further entrenched black communities into poverty and financial instability. Jim Crow laws also made it very difficult to acquire business licenses or insurance in areas like Birmingham, leading to the creation and maintenance of food deserts, which are linked to intergenerational poverty and are huge factors in the health and development problems for Black Americans. Enter the Civil Rights era. Most are already familiar with the details of the movement and famous individuals like Dr. King, Malcolm X, and Ella Baker, but the socioeconomic implications were immense. For the first time in history, the acknowledgement of the humanity and rights of people of color was codified into law. Rights to a good education, to full employment, and to fair housing acquisition catapulted the wealth generation in black communities for the first time in almost a century. While those laws did their job at erasing racist language and policy, they ultimately did little to address the systemic inequalities that institutions, built on prioritizing discrimination, had on communities of color. So now, we're past the civil rights movement, and we get this guy, ex-President Ronald Reagan. He is notorious for being a president, an actor, and all of these other things, which essentially worked harmoniously to screw over poor Americans. He was particularly exceptional at implementing racist policies through discriminatory institutions, criminal justice system, and ensuring the oppression and discrimination of people of color without being explicitly racist, quote unquote. Now, most presidents don't have the best track record when it comes to the well-being of black and brown communities. However, Reagan, Clinton, and Bush all did phenomenally well in wrecking the socioeconomic and political participation of all minorities. He's also infamous for being the political figurehead for one of the more detrimental economic policies the U.S. would advocate for, neoliberalism. We'll get into the details of neoliberal ideology in a future video, but the main gist is this. Those government policies on employment, pay, education, and housing enacted during the civil rights movement we talked about earlier, neoliberals aren't the biggest fans. In fact, the theory believes that the best way to regulate prices or raise wages for the working class is to incentivize competition. Sounds practical, but the best way of doing that in their mind? Removing any and all government regulation of the market, aka no social programs or aid, despite them being proven as effective methods for lessening poverty, giving access to better education and food, and alleviating homelessness. As such, you can see how Reaganomics negatively impacted red-line districts who had been denied resources for quite some time. Of course, his free market trickle-down strategies weren't the only things worrying black and brown individuals at the time. The 20th and 21st centuries also got to deal with gentrification. Poor communities of color were displaced from their neighborhoods following waves of incoming, better educated, primarily white residents. Black and brown-owned businesses found it difficult to compete with huge chain retailers that move into the area to accommodate a wealthier customer base and are forced to close. Driving out residents of color through higher property taxes, rent increases, and predatory housing practices meant the abandonment of roots, networks, and assets that are vital to generational wealth and are notoriously difficult to regain. While public schools will eventually see the effects of higher property values and their taxes, the only students who will experience the influx of resources will be a wealthier, generally whiter residency, as the students of color are displaced and the issue of school funding in poor communities remains unaddressed. Oakland is one of the most obvious examples, as it used to be a hub for black citizens during the Great Migration, from the Jim Crow South to a more liberal but still very segregationist California. Despite making up a majority of the industrial labor workforce, black Americans were still pushed into redlined, underinvested areas. As the years progressed, deindustrialization and white flight into surrounding Oakland suburbs led to racial, socioeconomic inequality soaring. The 2007 market crash only intensified the crisis, forcing thousands of residents to foreclose on their properties and look for new communities. The foreclosed properties were a flocking point for investors looking to resell at high prices, even though homelessness was at an all-time high. With the lack of affordable housing, decreases in income across communities of color, and no ability to reclaim their foreclosed homes, black and brown citizens only became further displaced. Their roots, their networks, and their community was gone. What used to be a city with a large plurality of people of color became one that lost 25% of its black population in less than a decade. The neoliberal thoughtchild that is gentrification not only compounds the issue of racial inequality and oppression, but its existence as a major force in the housing market makes it a systemic influence that requires significant legal intervention to eradicate. Communities of color continue to be affected by the systemic racism bred during the Jim Crow era and propped up during the Reagan administration. Black unemployment remains twice as high as white unemployment, and they are at higher risk of losing their jobs. Those communities that I spoke of earlier that were redlined, a great majority of them remain in concentrated areas of poverty, glimpses of a discriminatory past bleeding into the present. Schools in New York City are more segregated now than they were in the 60s. The homelessness crisis rages on, and the 1980s war on drugs continues to disenfranchise and economically disadvantage millions of Black and brown Americans. Wealth and class are interconnected with race more than ever, and the interconnection between the lack of wealth generation in Black communities and our incarceration, disenfranchisement, and our systemic silencing is pivotal in understanding how to dismantle the institutions that uphold our oppression. There is little way of identifying how to break the chains we've been shackled with without the knowledge to analyze how our socioeconomic status and wealth play an integral role in our success in this capitalist nation.